murality of the band, okay, and the impossibility or the absence of that band's movement outward into to the audience, right? So the whole the incident is that they're playing and the mic system stops working, right? So the band is playing, but people can't hear them, and basically some guy comes on the stage to try to fix the mic. And again, there's all kinds of different ways to understand it, to read it. Where first of all the impertinence of coming on the stage to fix it, which is precisely that kind of impertinence that jazz musicians are constantly railing against, right? Like the Mingus is, like Mingus makes a whole album called Charles Mingus Presents Charles Mingus, in which he fakes a live performance, right? He's even telling the imaginary audience to stop tinkling their glasses. It's like he gets to say everything that he ever wanted to say to the audience, to audiences who are disrespecting the music by not listening to it. But at the same time, he absolutely needs to create this social space because the band plays better live in front of people, right? So it's just a horrible dilemma, right? Okay, and so here's the dilemma, and it's a dilemma not only at the level of having to face the disrespect of the people of the people who are really not listening to the music, who think of the music as an occasion for some other kind of sociality that the music is somehow outside of, right? But he's also, I think, deeply invested in ways that even Mingus, as bristly a personality as he had, I mean, jazz musicians are just always talking about the power and the force of the music that they're playing, right? And I'm thinking about another great bassist, William Parker, who plays with Cecil, or who did for a long time. He talks about music as, as healing, right? As having this force, this power, which means that the musicians have this, and I mentioned this word yesterday, this evangelical responsibility, right? So that on the one hand, you don't interrupt the musicians because the audience can't hear. At the same time, it's important for the musicians that the audience can hear. And it's also important that the musicians hear one another. There's the intramurality of the band itself, and then this broader intramurality that they're trying to expand constantly on a certain kind of evangelical level, right? And in a different register, again, Professor Wilderson will talk about this in the piece on the prison slave as a necessity of a dance with death. Now, I wouldn't use this language, but I'm totally. Every time I read that essay, the weird thing is that in my mind, the soundtrack to that essay is a Wellington tune, "Invitation to Dance." Imagine my frustration at no invitation to dance, right? And you think about that from the position of anti-blackness, right? This is the horrible sort of sense of it, right? Is this tremendous desire for an intramurality, which at the same time would be the condition of possibility of the absolute obliteration, okay, of a certain notion of self. This is part of what I think it is that Cecil is getting at in the liner notes on unit structures, where he talks about improvisation as self-analysis. But the kind of analysis he's talking about, I think, is a Fanonian analysis, an interminable analysis, right? In that part in that long quote where Fanon says, this is not about the recuperation or the recovery of the self. This is about, or that formulation that Baraka makes in 65 in his essay on black music, the new black music is this: find the self, then kill it. Okay. So already, what you've got within the discourse of black radical poetics and social theory is a brutal, vicious critique, okay, of the self, of a certain notion of transcendental subjectivity. And the music is enacting this critique, and part of what it does is it requires us to produce new ways of understanding the phenomenon that people call the soloist, right? New ways of understanding and actually, if you she does it already, right, in her work. But the dialogue between Du Bois on the one hand and Erica Edwards on the other is precisely thinking through this and working this out by way of Cedric Robinson, right? Because what's at stake is recognizing that here the figure of the soloist is the one who is not only thrown up, okay, by the people, by the social field, but also given the gift of spirit, given charismata by the social field, right? So this is, and you can extrapolate from that figure of the soloist to the figure of the band, right? And it produces all kinds of tension. And there are protocols for this. Like, I'll never forget one time when I was at Berkeley, and they used to do a jazz festival at Berkeley. And there was, who came? It was like Winton's band came, and Celia Cruz. And she was, you know, and I'm just sitting there, man, she was amazing. And it was music that you were supposed to dance to. It's dance music. But to say that it was dance music was not to say that it was not listening music and not thinking music. And there are protocols for how to integrate dancing and listening and thinking, like what we were talking about yesterday, with Annette, right? So, and what was annoying and really frustrating was when you would see certain people who were dancing in a way that let you know that they were utterly ignoring those protocols, that they were not interested whatsoever in understanding them or learning those protocols, right? What they were interested in was getting loose, you see? And the music was an occasion for them to get loose, okay? And loose is an interesting word because it's connected up, etymologically to the root, the Greek word of lysis, to loosen, right? To unleash. But this is why, again, what Derrida says is this relationship between lysis and ana, this interplay between an unleashing and not a fixing, but a binding, right? A kind of, and I think that this is what, it feels to me like these are in totally different ways he would talk about it, I'm sure, and more rigorously, obviously, in the ways that he plays it, but this is what one is interested in Cecil, and it's like I remember one time at the jazz study group, this guy, he's kind of a bebop guy, and that tendency to think of what Cecil was doing as like a kind of charlatanry, and he's like, why do you like that stuff, And it was kind of an intimidating question because he's like a musician, right? And I'm not. I can't even read, And I was like, okay, well, I had to think about that, And I couldn't, and it wasn't, jazz segment was always cool, so nobody was ever doing any kind of nasty stuff. But underneath it was, I think, a tendency to maybe, it was kind of a put you in your place kind of a question, And but I thought, and I was just like, well, the thing I like about Cecil is that he's constantly making forms, And I think in response to your question, which is not at all like that question, and therefore more generative and productive, the way that I would think about it is that what your question allows me to understand is that it's not just that he's making forms within the context of a certain notion of musical form, he's making time and making places, right? In that way that, again, cuts, the transcendental aesthetic and that place of connection between the morbid body of the self and the morbid universe within which the self locates itself. So. If nothing else, I feel like I never read Fanon till reading Frank Wilderson and I'm embarrassed by some of the embarrassing things I used to say about Fanon. But now I feel like, so I'm hoping that if nothing else is conveyed today, it was just in reading those big long chunks, you could just see how deep he is, like how great that shit is, because I think that he's, and there's an urgency, to it that, and these infusions of narrative within it, all of which it strikes me as being part of a kind of aesthetic continuum that for me I would associate with Train and with Cecil. He's of that moment, and also Derrida and Deleuze and Foucault. Um, that kind of eruptive, form making kind of work that people were really doing, at that historical moment. So, okay, so way in the back, and then closer to Tiffany. Well, okay, so I'm gonna try and answer the first one now, and then I want you to, if because I think the second question is really important, and I also want to be able to know for sure that I understand exactly what you're talking about. So I'm gonna ask you to say it again, okay? But I'll do the first. Um, well, it's funny because there's a word that I use in this writing that I never probably really clarify, but um, but I but it indicates, let's say, a certain kind of, I don't know what you would call it, a theological kind of impetus in the work. Some of which I really have been working through under the sort of impetus and protection of a colleague of mine whose work is really important and brilliant, I think, named J. Carter. J. Cameron Carter wrote a great book called Race: A Theological Account. Um, so I guess you could say he's my spiritual guide in these matters, though I'm a heathen, in a certain kind of way. But J, but the word is transubstantial or transubstantiality, right? And obviously it comes from a certain, well, first of all, a certain kind of meditation on the Eucharist. Um, I'm totally fascinated with the way that Du Bois uses the term in Black Reconstruction in reference to Andrew Johnson, the transubstantiation of a poor white. But also, it becomes a really important term for a certain kind of phenomenological theology. The key figure, well, there's many figures, but the one that I've been trying to read is this guy named Robert Sokolowski, this Jesuit priest who writes about the Eucharist from a certain kind of Husserlian, perspective. And I'm interested in this notion of transubstantiation, not only because I think it already early on in sort of Christian, sort of philosophy and theological discourse, it already kind of provides a kind of beautiful disruption of a long sort of philosophical sort of discourse on substance. And there are all these reasons to want to turn away from it, but the notion of a kind of trans substance, the notion of this kind of divine or sacred mobility and transformationality and regenerativity, right? Is something which I'm interested in, you know. And obviously there's a whole bunch of different ways that you could kind of link up a certain kind of sacrificial discourse in Christianity with ways of thinking about, you know, the diaspora.